Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Julie. I do everything from book reviews to tarot, and if you are returning, I'm so glad I haven't scared you off. Now, what are we talking about today? Today I wanted to talk about The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Now, those of you familiar with Greek mythology will know that Achilles was a hero in those tales, known for his strength, swiftness on his feet, and also for the defeat of Hector in the battle for Troy. Now, the Song of Achilles tells Achilles' life story from boyhood to his faithful battles at Troy, and it's told largely through the eyes of his faithful companion of Patroclus, and we get to know his backstory as well. Those of you familiar with Achilles might also know of Patroclus. In other books that I've read, I'll put them up on the screen here, their relationship, Achilles and Patroclus, is largely hinted at being romantic, but you don't really get a sense. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say that this book heavily focuses on the development of their relationship and how they grew to be faithful companions and eventually lovers, mostly in secret. The story begins with Patroclus kind of as a young boy, how he became from an awkward prince, essentially, to then a prince in exile living in Achilles' kingdom. And kind of how these two boys grew up, the most unlikely of friendships, really. I mean, Achilles is half god, being born from the goddess Thetis, and his king father, King Peleus. Patroclus is essentially this awkward exile that no one pays attention to. There are other boys in Achilles' kingdom that are also exiled, and Patroclus is such an angry child, such a mistreated child, that he really doesn't get along with any of them. But it's so interesting to see how Achilles kind of is drawn to him for that surprising and mysterious and energy that Patroclus kind of has. And this story, I will say, is wall-to-wall character development. You really get a deepening sense of the relationship between these two men. Achilles is often painted as this battle-hardened man, this battle-hardened warrior who was so sure of his fate and has charged headlong into battle anyway. And in this story, you get a more complex vision of Achilles. He is not only a lover of music, a lover of playing the lyre, he feels so deeply for Patroclus and really would go to the ends of the earth for him. It is what eventually would lead to their relationship's downfall in the end. I'm not going to get into spoilers too much here, but to see how this figure, who we might know as battle-hardened and, not really emotional, have such a wealth of emotion and such a complex feelings toward his companion for life. It's really refreshing to see the duality of this character and how there's more than meets the eye, essentially. Those of you who have seen my other reviews before or read my other reviews on my blog will know that I'm a sucker for character development, and there is just a wealth of that here. Every character you meet is very nuanced. There's more than meets the eye to all of them, essentially. One of my favorite characters here, even though it's not going to be a popular opinion, would probably be Odysseus. He kind of reminds me of, if you guys know Game of Thrones, he's like Tyrion Lannister back when the writing was good. Very cunning, he has a way with words, and he's able to kind of be a mastermind to a lot of situations. For those of you familiar with Greek mythology, you'll know that the Trojan horse was kind of his master plan and his baby to kind of infiltrate the walls of Troy. That's not gone over in this book, because potential spoilers for Greek mythology, 3, 2, 1, Achilles and Patroclus both pass away before the fall of Troy inevitably happens. It is really Achilles' son who helps lead the charge, the final charge, in the war on Troy and the fall of Troy. And the battle, the first 10 years of the battles are Achilles and Patroclus' doing. Honestly, it's really hard to tell like what's a spoiler and what's not, because a lot of these books that I've read on these Greek mythologies are retellings, essentially. There's details changed, but these are classic stories, and it's like hard to know like what's considered a spoiler in this realm of things. Like most of you guys are going to know about the Trojan horse and the fall of Troy. It's not, I don't know if it's necessarily a spoiler, if it's actual, well, mythological history, let's say. But before I get into major spoilers, I'm going to give my final thoughts on the book overall. And then once we get into spoilers, I think I'll go into more of the things I didn't necessarily like. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. You get a deeper sense of the romance between Patroclus and Achilles. And like I said, the characters are extremely nuanced. This whole book is just a character study, essentially, of these two men and how they grew from being childhood companions to eventually being the most important relationship in each other's lives. And it's a beautiful story, beautifully told. It's not super long. It's 369 pages, but the spacing in the text, here, I'll get it for you guys. The spacing in the text is pretty generous, so it's not like super packed in terms of the text on the page. So I think it's a quick read. When I really dedicated myself to it, I finished the book in about 2 days. So, and I think it's kind of a breeze just based on the ease with which you get to know the characters, and the pacing is very good. You're pretty much not bored. That's a problem I've run into in some other stories I've read on this topic as well. I think there's a lot of like kind of meandering before battles and stuff, and you kind of get like, okay, it's a little bit repetitive now. And there are stretches where, they're on the beach in Troy and they're like waiting for these sieges to happen, and it's been years and years and years, and you're like, all right. So sometimes the pacing can get slow. I will say you can kind of feel the weight of different things that happen in other books because the pace is slower in other books. So a lot of times this book will speed through like plagues that happen to the men and stuff like that. And sometimes you don't get a feel for how serious different events were because they're kind of sped through a little bit. So at times it can be slow, at times it can be fast. But I don't know if it necessarily impacted the reading as much. You just kind of got a sense that, maybe certain things weren't so important, but then other books give them more importance. Again, that kind of just goes to the retelling of things. Different authors give different things various weights. That's like the most nondescript way I can say it. Basically, for example, in the Women of Troy, I'm going to use that as an example by Pat Barker. There's a plague that sweeps the Greek camp before during one of their sieges outside of Troy, and it's painted as this massive thing that takes all this time to repair, and it's really deadly and lethal. And this book paints it that way as well, but it's breezed through in a couple pages versus maybe a chapter in the Women of Troy. So it's like you kind of don't get the catastrophic sense of it as much as you would in other books. But that's again the nature of retelling. It wasn't bothersome. It was just kind of like, oh, that's interesting. The things that kind of bothered me, I guess, were really, when I compare it to other books that cover the topic. And that's kind of going to go into the spoiler section a little bit. I thought certain characters, mainly Briseis, I hope I'm saying her name right, was developed much differently in this book versus The Women of Troy, but again, that's spoiler territory. Overall, good book, highly recommend it, 8 out of 10. Now let's get into spoilers. See, the problem I have is, I don't know if it's necessarily fair to compare this retelling to other retellings, because the book should stand on its own. Technically, these stories aren't related, they're different authors, I don't know if it's fair, but based on what I've read, there are certain elements of the retelling that I prefer in other books. I think in Pat Barker's two book series, The Silence of the Girls and The Women of Troy, I like how Patroclus is a little bit better, slightly, in that book versus here. In that book, yes, he's nuanced in The Song of Achilles, but in The Silence of the Girls and in The Women of Troy, Patroclus is painted as a lot more capable of a person, and he's painted as a lot wiser than I think he is in The Song of Achilles. I think in this book he's painted as kind of like helpless without Achilles, whereas I never I never understood his character to be like that. I understood his character to, yes, be deeply in love with Achilles and be deeply concerned for him, but also a wise man, you know, able to stand on his own 2 feet and fight on his own 2 feet. He's not a fighter in this book at all. Whereas, you know, in previous books, he's been painted as, like, yeah, he's less capable than, you know, Achilles, you know, master of warfare, but he's still a competent warrior in a lot of ways, and an even more competent strategic eye on the battlefield. And I think he brings a lot more value to Achilles' professional life as a warrior than in this book. In this book, he almost is like the doting partner that worries about his man, you know, all the time, and like that's his role, and that's fine. I just feel like they took away a lot of his agency and a lot of his own personal strengths that I've seen in other books. And that was a little bit, not unsettling, maybe that's the wrong word, but maybe a little bit like, oh, I wish they, you know, made him more capable of a person. But again, like, if I hadn't read those other books, I think I would have liked this character interpretation fine. But because I have other knowledge to go off of, it's a little hard to ignore that. I would almost say that this book can be read alongside Pat Barker's books. I think most of the characters, with the exception of Patroclus, obviously a big deal right now, are pretty in line. Odysseus and Agamemnon are both painted pretty equally in both cases, in both Pat Barker and Madeline Miller's cases. Patroclus, again, I think could have been more evenly painted. And my other big problem is actually with Briseis. Probably the biggest change between the stories that I've read is probably with Briseis. She is painted as a farmhand that lives outside of the walls of the city of Troy. She's a common woman who learns Greek from her captors, is essentially happy to be there, ends up falling in love with Patroclus, a character arc that she didn't have in previous stories, and is essentially, like, I don't know, a happy slave, and she stands up to Achilles and speaks out of turn, which is something she would never do in previous books. In previous books, she's painted as a former queen of Lyrnessus. She's of noble birth, and that gives her access to kind of like these higher players and these other players in this world that we get a different sense of through her eyes. And she's very well educated. She has a quiet cunning about her that I think is kind of told in this book but not shown. They say that she's intelligent and that she's cunning, but like we don't really get a sense of that, and I think it's almost insulting to imply that she was happy to be captive. She kind of doesn't want to go back to the Trojan nation, and doesn't hope for rescue in the same way that she does in other books, which I think just like isn't necessarily fitting. Like, that doesn't make sense to me as like a concept that she'd be happy to be there. You know, so I didn't like that, and it's interesting because her story arc in previous books is kind of given to Patroclus. You know, Patroclus becomes interested in medicine as a young boy and eventually learns more about surgery and healing through his work on the Greek battlefield under Machaon. That's the exact character arc given to Briseis in previous books. She feels she has no purpose with the Greeks. She gets majorly depressed and kind of finds this passion in healing and medicine. Patroclus is left at the camps while the other Greeks go and fight, and he feels like he has no purpose other than, you know, being Achilles' partner, and he finds purpose in medicine. So I think it's kind of interesting how the purposes of each of these characters were kind of reversed and swapped, you know? So that's interesting to note. But again, I feel like these are almost nitpicks. I mean, like, it goes back to which retelling I like better, and if I didn't have other information to go off of, I would like this just fine, and that's what I have to go back to at the end of the day. I still think it's a worthwhile read. Just there are some elements I like better in other books, and I say that freely. I definitely still recommend this one, as I said earlier, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm interested to know what you guys thought. Next up, it looks like we have My Year of Rest and Relaxation, so I hope you guys are looking forward to that book, and I'll see you guys later. Check out more videos, and if you like this